My name is Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Welcome. For those of you who are not familiar with Fordham, we are one of the nation's leading education policy think tanks. We do work here in Washington, but we also do work on the ground in Ohio and specifically in our hometown of Dayton. So we don't just talk about education reform and promote it. We also do it on the ground in a real place with real kids. And we're very proud about that and have learned quite a bit about that. Very excited to be moderating today's session, a session that was really the idea came from Rick and Randy. My understanding is that Rick and Randy run into each other from time to time and said, all this debate and vigorous discussion around some of the big reforms that have been pushed through this year, often it's more heat than light. And so what could we do if we could get together and have a conversation that doesn't paper over our differences around some of these key issues, that admits that there are some serious disagreements about which way to go, but does that in a way that is not as personal or vitriolic as the public debate has often been. So that's the goal for today. Again, not to pretend that there are not disagreements about key issues, but to identify what those are and to see, if possible, if there's common ground. I don't think I need to do much introductions for our guests, but I'll say, of course, Randi Weingarten, the president of the American Federation of Teachers, Rick Hess, the director of the Education Policy Studies program at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, my job as moderator is to be fair. I don't think I can claim to be impartial. Rick's one of my best friends. We collaborate on a lot of things, including the Education Gadfly podcast, which if you're not listening to every week, you are missing out. Not necessarily on thoughtful education commentary, but certainly on Rick's latest musings about the world and pop culture. So tune into that. We did know that we were going to be having C-SPAN taping this, and so we're excited that Rick decided to wear pants for the occasion. With the Oprah-style format we have here, otherwise you would have been looking at Rick's knees the entire time. We weren't sure that America was ready for that. So thank you, Rick. Okay. So what we're going to talk about today are these big reforms related to teachers that have been vigorously debated in the last couple of years, but especially this spring in states around the country. The education reform conversation has talked about lots of different issues over the years, from standards and accountability, choice and charters. But now it seems like the conversation is getting to this sort of heart of the enterprise, what happens inside the classroom, and directly around teachers' professional lives. And so we're talking about things like evaluating teachers in new ways, talking about laying off teachers based on effectiveness instead of just on seniority, talking about paying teachers differently and tying that to performance, talking about curtailing collective bargaining rights. These are things that get very personal very quickly. And so we want to talk about all of these issues and, again, have a very polite but vigorous discussion and disagreement. Now, I come to this discussion, and again, we were a little bit recruited into playing this role and happy to do so. I should admit that there's some skepticism. And I want to read a quote from Stephen Brill just from the other day, just to set the context, okay? I'm sorry, Randy. By the way, I heard that, Randy, is it true you sat for 24 hours of interviews with Stephen Brill, he said. Pretty remarkable.
24, actually, that isn't true. But it did feel to me like it was endless.
Yes. There it is.
Okay, root canal, Stephen Brill.
Yes, okay. All right, so he says, quote, "The kumbaya feeling you get watching union leaders sit on panels with reformers and calmly discuss their joint mission to do what's best for children fades when you read the over-the-top lawsuits they have filed to block reform, or when you cull through their financial records or their campaign finance filings and see how they continue to sponsor the politicians who take the most hardline anti-reform positions and punish those who stray and support even the mild reforms that they claim to support." Okay, so that's some context here. Is again, we want to make sure that we are being honest when there are significant disagreements, but see if we can find some common ground. So let's get started. We're going to start with kind of a broad topic about teachers and reform, and particularly this idea about teachers feeling under attack right now in this moment in history. So let me start with you, Randy. Is your sense that teachers do feel under attack? How do we know that? I mean, is this just anecdotal, or do we have some good polling data? And what is it that's making them feel under attack right now?
So, first off, thank you. I'm glad we're doing this. There are people that actually do work in the summer in Washington, D.C. This is proof of that. Even Mike, and Mike, thank you for moderating. So even, not the question, but even the introduction, think about what Brill said. As you were quoting back that quote, which is pretty demagogic, I was thinking, I wonder whether my walking around Colorado a few days before Michael Bennett's re-election for Senate qualifies as one of those things. So what ends up happening in this debate, and you said it, is that it gets so polarized that as opposed to engaging in a real way, you end up first having to defend yourself, which seems silly in a world where we're actually trying to figure out how to educate kids. So, this is why teachers feel under attack. New PDK poll just came out last week. Last week, 2 weeks ago, whenever it came out. Losing track of time. As I get older, I lose track of time. One of the most interesting results of that poll said that even though teachers are respected more than ever before, more than administrators, more than principals, more than policymakers, even more than parents. And I say even more than parents because parents have a really important role in all of what we do. They said that 2/3 of the reporting that they see on education is negative. And so when you have that steady drumbeat of negativity, when people are called names or even the kind of gross characterizations that Brill repeatedly makes in the book, people feel badly about it. And people feel badly even when, Mike, when you were talking about the kind of this kind of session about how we're focused on teachers. You used the word evaluating teachers, laying teachers off, paying teachers. My teacher voice, and I taught full and part-time, Clara Barton High School in Brooklyn. My teacher voice started saying, well, what about the tools and conditions I need to do my job? And that's never actually in the debate, even though what teachers have said to us, their union, is that basically help us get the tools and conditions we need to do our jobs. So, you can look at lots of different things, but over and over and over again, that's why teachers feel badly. And the economic situation has, I think, made it worse.
So what do you think, Rick? Are teachers under attack?
Yeah, so I think this is one Randy and I just come at it from very different perspectives. And I think, first off, let me stipulate that I think Randy made two, perfectly reasonable points here. One is that as we talk about holding anybody accountable for the work they do, it makes sense to talk about making sure we're putting them in a position to succeed, that there's that balance, tools and conditions, as Randy said. And I think that is absolutely fair. Second, Randy alluded to the point about 2/3 of coverage seeming negative. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that. I mean, I don't know the research on this, but as I think about coverage of healthcare, about transportation, about airlines, about banking, it strikes me that 2/3 is probably not an unusual mix for kind of negative versus positive in coverage of anything that's in the public domain. So a couple of more specific points here. One, that as Randy mentioned, in the PDK poll, we know that in 1984, 50% of Americans polled gave teachers an A or a B. Today, it's 69%. In the early 1990s, about 53% of Americans said they'd like their child to become a teacher. Today, it's about 2/3. So one interesting backdrop is for all the talk of assault through the era of choice and accountability in Teach for America, somehow or other, esteem for the teaching profession seems to have raised pretty dramatically. Now, a more fundamental point I want to make, though, is that there is this kind of narrative out there that you've got these mean-spirited, particularly Republican governors who are on the warpath against teachers. And I just think that is, I think that is just an enormously problematic reading of what these folks have said. What Scott Walker said this winter was, he said, we're broke, it's about time somebody stood up and told the truth. He said, I have great respect for the more than 300,000 state and local government employees who work here in the state of Wisconsin. They're good, decent, hardworking people. They're professionals, blah, blah. A Wisconsin State Senator, Leah Vukmer, said, from our perspective, it's about money. The state of Wisconsin is broke. We're out of that negotiating ability. We don't have anything to give anyone more. Governor Chris Christie said last fall, we have to get realistic in telling people the truth. Nobody wanted the teachers laid off, not me, not the school board, not the teachers union. So I would argue that this does not sound to me like demagoguery. I mean, I think Stephen Brill is another question. But these elected leaders, I think, have actually been quite measured. And in response, if you think back to Wisconsin 6 months ago, Wisconsin was compared to pre-Nazi Germany. Walker was compared to Hitler and Mubarak. The Speaker of the Wisconsin State House, Fitzgerald, was threatened with an email. We have all planned to assault you by arriving at your house and putting a nice little bullet in your head. However, this isn't enough, it went on. Senator Kapanke, who had nails scattered on his driveway and his windshield broken, received an email. We will hunt you down. We will slit your throats. We will drink your blood. I will have your decapitated head on a pike in the Madison Town Square. This is your last warning. There were thousands of these reported to the Wisconsin state government and collected and investigated. So, you know, the notion that somehow it was those pushing to roll back collective bargaining were somehow using vitriol or on the warpath, and that their opponents were somehow being measured and responsible is, to me at least, I think, a misreading of the dialogue.
Randy?
So, look, I agree with you, Rick, that any time that I'm very concerned about the demagoguery. And in fact, years ago, you know, I got in big trouble when I said that educators have a right of freedom of speech, but we also have a responsibility in terms of how we use it. And you know that, you know, and I got in big trouble for saying that by lots of people who said, you know, you should just protect the freedom of speech. Our Wisconsin Federation also got these kind of death threats. When I've seen people put up signs like comparing a public figure to Hitler, I denounce that. I think that's wrong. I think that we have to be really careful about what the origins of fascism are, and we have to be really careful in terms of protecting our democracy. But where I diverge from you is that the facts are very different than what you said in terms of Wisconsin. And the facts about Chris Christie are very different. I watched the YouTube video of when a teacher said something to Christie that he went right at that teacher and bullied that teacher. And that was a public official doing that in a very demagogic way. I also watched the Wisconsin unions basically tell Walker, we will negotiate these issues. And he refused. He never met with them once. The issue is not budget. The issue was whether or not they have a right to collectively bargain. And what we saw right after Walker was elected was that the contract that the last governor and the state employees had done, which included millions and millions of dollars of concessions, Walker found a way to reject using the state Senate. So this was not about budget. This was actually about getting rid of rights. And I think that the piece that you didn't say was that, and the piece that we're really that everyone started looking at and kind of shaking their head about, was that when Walker pushed through the budget repair bill initially, he also said he was going to call the state police out because he expected there to be violence. And if you remember the punk call with the Koch brothers, he went on and on and on through the kind of things that they were trying to do, including infiltrate the crowd to try to create that kind of violence. So the issue here in terms of Walker or Kasich or the Rick Scott is that no one's saying that there shouldn't be a real dispassionate look at what we can do. But the unions in Wisconsin agreed to the demands, and they were not even given the respect to have a meeting with Walker. He wanted to eliminate collective bargaining.
So let's talk some more about that right now. We were going to get to that later, but let's go ahead and talk some more about Wisconsin. So Rick, I mean, as an educator, how can you support what Governor Walker did in Wisconsin? I mean, people say, look, he was clearly just trying to score political points. He was going after teachers and not some of the other public sector workers. You know, why weaken the public sector, not the private sector unions? I mean, what's wrong with this idea that teachers should have a right to collectively bargain?
So, I mean, I think there's a couple things going on. One, again, to kind of Randy's point about it's important how this stuff is presented and addressed. I thought it was unfortunate that Walker carved out, I believe it was safety and fire workers, right? So police and fire.
The ones who endorsed him.
Which is
a coincidence, surely.
Which is problematic. On the other hand,
which is one of those litigations that are now happening.
On the other hand, if we think about, say, President Obama's strategy on healthcare reform, that there was an interesting array of carve-outs for organizations that had been smart enough to get behind Obama during the 2008 campaign. So part of the way deal-making occurs, like it or not, in a democratic society, is sometimes these issues are addressed in a manner that is less principled than we might like. Look, the reality is that there's two issues on the table when we talk about the Wisconsin collective bargaining. One is, as Randy points to, that there was the short-term fiscal crunch. And here, not only is she right that WEAC and other unions had indicated they were open about going, to my mind, finally going to the table to talk about redressing some of the issues with both health care and pension. But the more fundamental question is those givebacks weren't going to make a big dent in the short-term fiscal picture. They just weren't. However, there's a second and to me more fundamental question, which is that Wisconsin, like the federal government, like just about every state government, has been living beyond its means for decades. There are accumulated shortfalls and deficits. And the problem is that we have had governor after governor and state after state who has been content to kick the can down the road. And so the real rationale for trying to both roll back collective bargaining and to go after teacher contributions to pension and health care was not because that was actually going to help with the 2012-2013 deficit. Here, I think Walker was, less than forthcoming. It's because it was to change a trajectory as you look 5-10 years out in terms of the fiscal condition of the state.
But, Rick, why do you need to curtail collective bargaining rights in order to change that trajectory?
Because school boards and superintendents in Wisconsin and elsewhere have made it clear that they lack the intestinal fortitude to negotiate responsibly or to do a good job of curtailing giveaways. One example, the Wisconsin teacher pension system, for instance, stipulates that employers will make a 6.8% contribution to the pension system on behalf of employees. Employees were to make 6.2%. The Milwaukee Public Schools in 1996 negotiated away so that they are paying the entirety of the employee share. So 13% payment on top of each employee. In addition to that, there was a supplemental 4.2% contribution made entirely by the district. So MPS was paying 17.2% of each teacher position into pensions and supplementary pensions. Employees were making zero contribution. It's probably not a shock that while the median compensation for an MPS teacher this last year was $56,000, fully loaded with benefits, they were $100,000 apiece. School boards and superintendents who are engaging in this over a period of decades have suggested that they are, frankly, probably not to be trusted in these kinds of negotiations.
So basically, Governor Walker took away local control over these issues.
Well, what he did, there's a couple things when we talk about public collective bargaining. First off, remember, public collective bargaining at the federal level was illegal until 1962 when President Kennedy issued an executive order. It was illegal for state and local employees until the 1950s, depends on the state. Wisconsin, I believe it was 59. Frankly, there's a famous letter from Franklin Roosevelt to the president of the National Federation of Federal Employees, where he pointed out that all government employees should realize that the process of collective bargaining is usually understood cannot be transplanted into the public sector. It has distinct and insurmountable limitations when applied to public personnel management. This is FDR. And the reason it has unique and insurmountable problems in the public sector is in the private sector, if your giveaways are too generous, if they're too unaffordable, if you're General Motors, competition could come in and knock your block off. In the public sector, unfortunately, you don't actually have these self-correcting mechanisms.
Randy?
So, and then there's also a quote by Ronald Reagan who says, and I don't have it with me, who talked about how important collective bargaining was, including in the public sector. And he gets people
This stuff
focus.
gets so complicated.
I know, but what I'm saying is that if FDR was alive today, as are his successors, and he would have a very different view of it for the following reason. I think he would have a different view for the following reason. There's a fundamental difference of understanding in terms of the workplace and what you can do using collective bargaining. And so I want to actually go back to the Wisconsin situation for a sec. I was, there's been a lot of negativity about unions in the last, 20 years. And in bad economic times, what we've seen a lot of people do is say, they have benefits that are here, we have benefits that are lower than this, why shouldn't there be a race to the bottom? Which is a very different ideal than America normally has. America normally is about lifting all boats. America normally is about hope, not fear. But you can see in the economic anguish that we have right now, the kind of negativity. The same thing, Rick, is what you said about, in health and transportation, we look for the negative before the positive. Education, a lot of times, you see districts that are doing quite well, that have public confidence, you see a connection between public confidence and districts that are doing quite well. You see in education, in some ways, the only opportunity in a capitalist democracy that is provided to all kids, different in different states, but provided to all kids. You see a service that is really about hope, not fear. So there is a kind of like a cognitive dissonance between those of us that are in education and those people around that are reporting about it or thinking about it in the kind of negativity. What collective bargaining does is it's actually the vehicle by which to create not just economic dignity for people, but to actually create voice to enable the tools and conditions that teachers need. And that's what collective bargaining has done in districts that have actually worked effectively, both here and abroad. And that gets missed in this entire debate. So, for example, in New Haven, there is they really one of the most innovative, interesting contracts in a long time, because they actually use collective bargaining to problem solve. In Toledo, in the last few months, with the cuts that they had, they used collective bargaining to problem solve. In Baltimore, they used collective bargaining to problem solve. Now, that's different than the whole issue in terms of pensions and things like that, because a lot of that was actually statutory, not done through collective bargaining. My point is, when actually the public was confronted with, should people's rights be stripped away? In Wisconsin and Ohio, 2/3 of the public in the winter said no. The rights shouldn't be stripped away. Does it mean that we have to use these rights responsibly? Yes. But when you start thinking about what's happened in America these days, and even you said it, okay, we don't trust our elected officials, so let's strip away their right to actually do something. That's not accountability. Accountability should then be, then the next election, people are accountable for what they've done. And the same is true in terms of, and then I'll stop, the separate and apart from the collective bargaining issues around the country, the other underlying issue that's very, very, very disturbing is voting suppression, voting rights. There have been many states that have actually and many of these new Republican governors who have actually attempted to change voting rights in a lot of these states. So that is happening at the very same time people like you and others are talking about pensions. 36 states have changed pension laws to create more contributions on behalf of or on the part of employees. Take a place like Wisconsin. That was done, but at the same time, there were tax cuts in capital gains. So where is the fairness here? When you have entities like G who pay actually less taxes as a corporation than a Wisconsin custodian. Where's the fairness when the Wisconsin governor says, oh, we need to go after this in terms of benefits, when the average pension benefit across the nation is about $400, $450 a month? Where's the fairness when that happens, and yet no one in this fiscal issue on your side of the debate talks about taxing, billionaires?
All right, so lots of different things to pick up on here. Randy, I think one thing Rick was arguing with taking this collective bargaining off the table for local school boards is that these local school boards are often elected by unions. I mean, the unions are the driver in getting school board members elected, and we have examples, certainly happen in Dayton, where if reformers do come into office, the union will mobilize and get them out in the next election. So if that is the dynamic, doesn't it make sense to say, well, that is kind of some perversion of democracy, and so we have to address it by taking some of these rights away or moving to mayoral control or something else like that?
Well, look, we actually, first off, we now argue using the exceptions to make the case. There have been lots and lots of elections throughout, whether it's school board elections, whether it's senatorial elections, whether it's other kinds of elections, where lots of people have gotten engaged. I've often seen the role of the union exaggerated when it comes to elections of school boards or other kinds of things, and I've watched now the role of money in all of this totally and completely change the relationship everywhere. Now, people should have a right to engage politically. That is part of our democracy. But separate and apart from that, take those situations like mayoral control versus elected school boards. Is there any dispositive proof that any one of these structures work better than any other of these structures? I've watched we supported in New York City Mayor Bloomberg, mayoral control. The union stepped up to support that because we thought that we needed to have a more cohesive accountability system. I suspect that when this version of mayoral control expires, there'll be very little support for it because of the way it was used. And the same thing, you could say the same thing about everything. If there is if a district is not focused on how we educate kids in a real way for the knowledge economy, they're going to be called to account. And everybody's going to be called to account. And frankly, what we've been saying is let's all step up and try to do far more to deal with the real issues, which are how do we, as the economy races forward, and we see so many differences in terms of the knowledge and skill that kids need, at the very same time as the bottom is still falling out for regular folk. How do school districts engage? Yeah. That's the real issue.
Now, Rick, what do you say to Randy when she says, hey, we are trying to balance the budgets on the back of kids and teachers who aren't making huge salaries? Why aren't we talking on the right about taxing and taxing at the upper brackets as a big part of the solution too?
Well, I mean, the reality is we've been living beyond our means as a nation and in these individial states for 20 plus.
You got to use the mic.
So the reality is we've been living beyond our means as a nation and in these states for 20 plus years. Where as of 2009, Pension funds pensions were underfunded by 1.26 trillion nationally, according to Pew. At the federal level, we're spending $1.5 trillion a year more than we have right now. So we absolutely are going to be raising taxes. In fact, if we went ahead and did the tax increases that President Obama suggested this summer, taxing corporate jets, putting an end to the Bush tax cuts for the rich families making more than $250,000 a year, that would raise about $85 billion next year. Now, given that we're going to borrow $1.5 trillion, that would mean we were only borrowing $1.4 trillion against the future next year. Now, of course, that would also mean that our top marginal tax rates for families making 250 plus in your average state are going to be about 55%. We can certainly take them higher. That's 55% when you add up the federal rate they're paying, their state rate, and their Social Security contribution. Now, if you go ahead and take that higher, which is certainly feasible, it was 70% of each dollar earned when President Reagan became office over a certain point. There were concerns that you actually start to discourage economic productivity among people when they're paying 65 or 70 cents on the dollar to state, local, federal government. But you can certainly go there. The reality, though, is even if we do those tax increases, at best we're bringing in maybe $300 billion a year, which is terrific, except that it means we're still spending $1.2 trillion we don't have each year for the foreseeable future. So I'm absolutely sympathetic to Randy's point that we're going to have to generate more revenues, but the notion that if we do so, that will alleviate the need to dial back unaffordable promises is nothing but a fairy tale. We also need to take a look at unaffordable promises that have been made by irresponsible politicians over the past 20 or 30 years, and that is going to address both national entitlements, like Social Security and Medicare, and also state-level entitlements, like pensions and health care. And so I'm sympathetic to Randy's point that we need to be talking about all of this. I totally agree. But the reality is that we are going to have a choice very shortly, and we have it right now, where the marginal dollar in tax dollars at the state and local level, is it going to go into the classroom to educate our kids, or is it going to pay retirement promises in terms of pensions and health care to retirees? And frankly, I know which side of that issue I'm on.
So we have this may be far afield from what instructional practices teachers should use to implement the Common Core, but there is a constant macro and micro issue that we're all facing. And as Rick was saying that, I recollected back to we had in our union a pension task force to deal with a lot of these issues. And one of the things you saw was the fairly modest pensions that are done in the public sector still cost a whole bunch of money. And the issue becomes when the market goes wild, as it's been going right now, how are the pension costs sustained? And one of the things we said was, let's have a modern pension system. So no spiking, there should be constant contributions in terms of both employers and employees. But this is the point that I think Rick is missing in all this. There have been modest salaries in the public sector, and retirement benefits are part of those salaries. The macro point is this for America. What happens 10 or 20 years from now when no one has a retirement benefit and people are 70 and 80 years old? What happens? And what you see in the polling that we've done and others is huge retirement insecurity. So Rick is talking about how we actually make the situation in terms of retirement insecurity worse on a macro level by getting rid of it on a micro level. What we need to actually do is we need to actually think about what happens in this country long term when you have people getting older and older and working till they're in their 50s or 60s, and what happens afterwards. that's, in some ways, the public sector and bargaining solved that by saying modest wages, but also deferred compensation in terms of pensions. And that's a big long-term problem.
Okay, one more point, Rick, then we're going to turn the page.
Just two things here. One, I think Randy and I disagree to a fair bit on how modest teacher compensation is. Median teacher pay in the U.S. is $54,000. Fully loaded, it's somewhere in the low 70s. That's with benefit and health care costs. $54,000 is higher than median salary. It depends on now one's benchmarks in terms of how do you do comparables. But let's also keep in mind that the typical teacher work year is 190 days instead of 235 or 240. So I think there's a number of issues here when we start to talk about teacher compensation in current dollars and in retirement, and reasonable people can come at this in different ways. The second thing is I think Randy's exactly right, that the real issue here is long-term. For instance, one relatively simple way to start talking about getting retiree health care and pensions under control in the public sector for teachers and to protect payouts is to take the norm of teacher retirement from 30 years to 40 years in pension systems, so that teachers are expected to retire at about 65 rather than 55 or 57, which is, of course, a legacy of a much earlier era when we thought of public sector pensions as fitting a very different demographic profile in terms of how long we expected to live. So I certainly think Randy's right that there is good and serious room for people to talk about how do we build these solutions in ways that work. But I suspect that if Randy were to try to put together before a team of even, admirable AFT teachers, the notion that they ought to extend by another decade their anticipation of career longevity in order to qualify for full benefits, that it would not be received particularly warmly.
So, I'm giggling as you're talking about that, because at the same time as some of the as we've seen those proposals, we've also seen proposals that say, let's look at experience, and let's be fairly negative about experience, and let's just have younger and which I don't actually subscribe to. I subscribe to we need newer teachers and we need experienced teachers, and we need that kind of balance, and that kind of balance in a school is fantastic. But so you can't actually, on the one hand, say teachers should actually work longer, and on the other hand say, but by the way, we're actually not going to give them the opportunity to work longer. There are a lot of teachers that actually work 30, 40 years. There are also folks who, at their 20th or 25th year, say, I have to do something else, or I'm tired. And frankly, one of the things that we need to do is we need to actually do things like have different kinds of career ladders for teachers so that you can do something different with those skills. I do actually think we are losing huge, at the very same time as skill and knowledge is so important, we need to maintain that kind of experience. But I'm not saying that we don't have to confront pension issues and long-term retirement security issues and long-term health security issues. But, the teachers are not gazillionaires. And what they do is, as part of the benefit package, if you're actually planning for retirement and saving for retirement, that is really good for the economy, and that is really good for a community. But the last thing I want to say is this on economics. I think there's a fundamental misstatement that happens, and we saw it in the debt ceiling debate about debt. The last Democratic president in the United States of America actually ended his presidency not with a debt but with a surplus. And that was, a decade or so ago. What is the fundamental reason that we have the debt that we have right now? We have 3 wars that we're engaged in right now. We have tax cuts that were never paid for, and we have a prescription drug benefit that was never paid for. So there's a bunch of different reasons why we're in the crisis that we're in. A lot of it is not because of the education spending that we have done over the course of time. And frankly, what's happened is that we will actually disinvest from our kids at the very same time as the economy is changing, and then say that the promises that were made, deferred pension, to people who actually worked in this field when there was moderate salaries should not be paid. Something is just fundamentally off about that.
So just 2 points here. One, I think Randi makes a nice point, which is one I think the reformers often give short shrift, which is that teachers have entered the profession with an implicit understanding. This also comes up when we talk about how we're going to treat seniority in terms of school assignment and classroom assignment. That teachers who've been in the field 10, 15, 20 years absolutely entered the field with a certain set of implicit understandings about compensation, about benefits. And Randi's right. I think any of us, when we think we've got one set of deals on the table, and then people come in and self-righteously tell us that doesn't work, there's absolutely, I think any of us would feel that we were being dealt dirty.
Yep.
And so I'm sympathetic. Just a second point, though, here. Actually, you know what? I can remember, so let's leave it at that.
All right, good. So we're going to get back to some of these other issues, but this is very helpful. And some of the things that I'm hearing, by the way, in terms of agreement so far, you both are against demagoguery. Good. Okay, that's something. I think you both agreed that that WEAC in Wisconsin's case, that there was some evidence that they were willing to deal. Though Rick's point was that that would only have an impact in the short term, and there were some of these longer term issues. And that this retirement situation is a big issue, and that I think you both agreed that there is concern that to solve the debt crisis, there's going to be disinvestment from kids. There's this sort of intergenerational concern going on right now that we might be continuing to transfer wealth from the young to the old.
Actually, and that was the point I want to make. Just real quick, that I think, unfortunately, because we have made these expansive promises, we're in a position where we're having to dial back investments in all kinds of areas we care about, infrastructure, schools, kids. And partly that's because we have made a set of bloated and, I think at this point, unwise commitments to the elderly. Frankly, when we started Medicare 45 years ago, the poverty rate among the elderly was substantially higher than it was among America's children. Today, the poverty rate among the elderly is about half of what it is among America's children. And what we are doing is we have tied up substantial resources in spending dollars on the over 65s. And I think the pension and health care conversation, education, is part of it. I agree entirely with Randi that that if we're serious about doing right by our kids and educational improvement, we want to be putting more dollars into the kids, partly because it's a good investment and partly because it's the right thing to do. But we also need to, we need to have the intestinal fortitude to say that we can't do everything in the world that it would be swell to do. And one of the things this requires is we have to take a hard look at what we have promised we're going to do for the elderly.
All right. I don't want to get too much into a Social Security and Medicare debate, but I think there's clear disagreement. And Randi's point about the sort of race to the bottom versus race to the top, right? The concern that says, let's not get to the point where we're saying let's have retirement insecurity for everybody.
Right. Look, this is a really interesting economic discussion we're having on a macro level. And it wouldn't surprise Rick that I come from a Keynesian belief that you have to actually create jobs and try to figure out ways of filling those jobs. But, one of the things I'm haunted by right now is that at the same time as we have this, 9% unemployment rate, regardless of what the effective unemployment rate is for folks, there are 3 million jobs available in the United States of America that are not filled because of the skill mismatch. And that's the kind of thing that we should be working on a micro level right now. It's the kind of thing that if we actually had in different communities, what are the business needs? What are the skills of people? Are there ways of kind of creating a match? Or is there a role for community colleges and others to create maybe some wraparound services around schools in order to do that? that these are the kinds of problems that America should be able to solve right now, as opposed to, ultimately simply thinking about the big macro problems. And that's the, and because at the end of the day, when you have an economic downturn, the likes of which we've had now, which most Americans did not create, recklessness in my hometown on Wall Street, recklessness in the housing market created it more than basic Americans. But when you have this, you also have the safety net kicking in for more and more people, so it means that there's more and more of a burden on state and localities, food stamps, Medicaid, all these other things, unemployment, they kick in when people have less and less jobs. When there are more and more jobs available, people are paying taxes. There's more revenues. There's more in the coffers. There's less debt. There's more surplus. So I actually get to this debate saying jobs, 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 jobs. And we have in the labor movement said jobs, 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 jobs for a long time. And in fact, one of our proposals in terms of pension funds is that this is there's a tremendous amount of capital in pension funds throughout the country. Let's use it for infrastructure. Let's use it to create jobs. Let's use it for some of the things we need to do. Let's do things differently now that America used to do. We are so timid about doing kind of new big things. So that's one of our ideas, and that's one of the things we've talked to pension funds around the country about.
Okay. By the way, for those of you watching online, you can send us questions. We're going to get to questions in a little bit. You can ask a question on Twitter using the hashtag WRTT, when reform touches teachers, or email us at questions@edexcellence.net. Okay, let me get back. We started this discussion, and we moved away from it. But I want to get back to this question about teachers feeling under attack. Okay. And fundamentally, let me ask you this, Randi. Is there any way for reformers to promote the kinds of changes we're talking about here, right? Curtailing pension benefits and healthcare benefits and changing evaluations and making jobs less secure. Is there any way of reformers promoting that agenda that is not going to make teachers feel under attack? Is this, in other words, is this like these policies they're just not going to like, or is it a communications failure?
Well, if the policies are, how can we take something from you, as opposed to how can we make education better? But if it's framed as we're going to take something from you, then of course there's going to be reaction to that. If these are policies that say, let's start with what do kids need to know and be able to do in the 21st century, and how are we going to help all kids, not some kids, get there, then that is an engagement strategy that everyone should want to be involved in. And so
right, but isn't that the Stephen Brill point? Okay, we all love kids. We all care about kids in the future. And
I did bring one prop because, I am really, it's actually hard to create a trusting, innovative environment. I've been a boss for a long time. I've been a boss at the in the UFT. I was the president, and from 1999 to 2008. At the American Federation of Teachers, I've been the president from 2008 to now. That's managed a lot of people. Been a boss for a long time. It is much harder as a boss to actually try to build a culture of trust and innovation, and to collaborate. It's much easier to bark and order. It's much less effective to bark and order, and it's much more effective to do this. This is not kumbaya. And when people talk about it as kumbaya, it trivializes our work. And so the issue in terms of teachers is they are on the ground actually being the ones who implement all of these high-minded policies that we talk about. And so the question becomes, how do you engage them in that implementation? The implementation is often the hardest, even things that we would all agree on. Teachers should be qualified, whether you call it effective or qualified. Okay, how do you make that happen? How do you ensure that that's real? How do you ensure that? Take another policy. I think on this stage we probably, I'm not sure, but I think we probably agree that there should be high standards for children. And I think we probably agree there should be high expectations. Good. Let's get our sandals on. And I think, and the guitar. And I think we probably agree. Oh, good. There should be, that there should be some curriculum. Some of us may agree that there should be Common Core. Some of us may not. But how do you then ensure that happens? And so if we engaged in the conversation that way, that would be one thing. But if we engaged in the conversation saying, I'm about to tell you that you have to work harder, but I'm lopping off 20% of your salary because nobody can afford it, and you should be just happy that you have a job, that's not going to be a pleasant conversation with anyone. And worse, it's going to be hugely demoralizing, and I think it's going to be a step backward, not a step forward.
Rick, what do you think about this?
So I think Randy's right. When you tell people that they're not going to get as much as they're used to getting or as they think they're entitled to, they're going to be upset. And I think, unfortunately, I think that's a position that feckless leadership has gotten us to. I think there's two strands of reform here. One strand is the kinds of things that are directly centered on instruction, on pedagogy, on scope and sequence and pacing, and all the stuff where teachers know more about it than anybody who's sitting on the outside looking in. And there, I think it makes all the sense in the world to approach these things in a collaborative fashion, where we are giving teachers opportunities to lend their expertise, to shape what we're doing, and then holding them accountable.
By the way, would you support what Randy was saying about getting some of that kind of stuff into collective bargaining agreements?
No, absolutely not. I think that ought to happen outside the framework of collective bargaining, because I think collective bargaining frames it in a way that rigidifies it and unproductively and unhelpfully. One important kind of disagreement there is whether it's useful to do that in terms of collective bargaining or not. Friends of ours, Julie Kopic, Chuck Kirchner, have talked about United Mine Workers and the new unionism for a long time. I am deeply skeptical that this stuff actually works out the way it's supposed to. Randy obviously has a different opinion, and I think one of the things I wish to God we could do more effectively is recognize that smart, thoughtful people can look at the same facts, look at the same experiences, and just come to different conclusions about their promise without necessarily imagining that the other person must have nefarious motives. So that said, so there's one strand of reform where I agree on principle very much with Randy, even if I disagree on how we would go about it. But I think there's a second strand of reform, like Randy alluded to, when it comes to staffing ratios, when it comes to benefits, when it comes to compensation structures, where what we're doing is talking about saying to teachers, we have increased nominal per pupil spending threefold since after inflation, per pupil spending threefold since the early 70s. Most of this money has gone into hiring more warm bodies. We've gone from a 23-to-1 student-teacher ratio in 1973 to about a 15.5-to-1 student-teacher ratio today. This has necessitated more hiring, lots more benefits, lots more bodies that we can't train adequately. And what I would much prefer to see us do is have fewer educators, pay them better, but at the end of the day, educators may or may not feel that this is a good trade-off. And these kinds of policy determinations, are frequently, I think, going to happen, whether or not teachers are comfortable with them.
And I think on the economics, I'm actually troubled by some of the kind of global spending conclusions that I hear all the time. Because when you impact the numbers, you see what that spending is for. We've had a 50% increase from the early 80s to now in terms of special needs children. And the spending on special needs children is higher than the spending on children that don't have special needs. Now, is that an important value? Probably so. But that's what that's what some of that number is. Also, what's interesting is that in the countries that outcompete us, when you actually unpack their spending, retirement and health benefits are not in their equation. And that's about, as Rick has said, that's about 13%. So it's an apples to oranges comparison. And when you take that out of the comparison, the numbers in terms of as a percentage of GDP, look more similar. The issue, though, is what is this actual spending on teachers for? And what we've actually seen on the ground is that class sizes haven't gone down. So that if you're a high school teacher, for example, you're working with 150 to 200 kids a day. And how are you going to have the engagement to ensure, again, I'm going back to what do kids need to know and be able to do in the global economy? How are you going to create the environment that creates innovation and creativity and critical thinking with 150 to 200 kids, so that when we hear Rick's numbers about that the student-teacher ratios have gone down like that, what we're seeing on the ground is an increase of testing coordinators, an increase of people who are engaged in standardized test issues, an increase in those kinds of things, as opposed to the things that, again, I'll go back to the tools and conditions. This is part of the reason why, if we use collective bargaining the right way, and this is where I also think that Rick is right, the contracts become really unflexible. The biggest challenge I think we have is something that Shanker said a long time ago. I said in 2004 or 5, Shanker said beforehand, Feldman, also one of my successors, said beforehand, Mark Tucker has just said recently, how do we actually change schools to, and Kopich has said it, how do we change schools from this industrial model to a knowledge model? And how do we use collective bargaining in a craft model? How do we actually do these kinds of things? And so what I would like to see is, let's try some of these experiments. Green Dot was one of the experiments we tried in terms of seeing how you can mesh in a 360-degree accountability system a lot of the tools and conditions teachers need, as well as the accountability that Mike Petrilli and others are talking about. How do you mesh this? And I think, given that we have this huge, there's 15,000 school districts in the United States, 100,000 schools in the United States, we could try some of this kind of experimentation in a way to see, can we build a new system? Not the entire new system, but can we build some experiments like this?
Sounds a lot like charter schools.
Well, it was supposed to be a lot of what charter schools were, but look at what charter schools have become. They pretty much look like the regular system without contracts in so many different places. And I'll stop here, but take something that was mentioned today in the Times. Luis Ubiñas and Chris Gabrielli actually did something about extended time, talking about the Edwards Middle School. It's not extended time per se, but how they use it. And the way in which they use extended time to create, I've been at that school, to create, it's a very shared leadership school. There's the union is very engaged in that school. They use the extended time to engage kids and to use data correctly. So the point here is, how do you actually use collective bargaining to try to break through this industrial model, come up with different kinds of models, and get the kind of tools and conditions, but use collective bargaining as an accountability and leveraging agent to do that kind of better mix.
Okay, I want to get to one issue and then get the audience in here. Teacher evaluations and this larger issue of finding a way to weed out the low performers and terminate them if they're not doing their job.
Right.
That a lot of people say, look, this is what a lot of these discussions come down to. We have a system where we cannot, in a timely or cost-effective way, remove ineffective teachers from the classroom. I mean, Rick, would you say that this is what the whole teacher evaluation push at the end of the day is about?
Yeah, I think in large part. And I think it's been driven by the fact, and again, much like with the problems with district giveaways in terms of benefits and restrictions, that reformers have gotten into this habit of scapegoating unions while letting feckless school boards and superintendents off the hook. I think, once again, this is a case of that. If you look at the new teacher project widget work, for instance, and we see 99% of teachers being evaluated as satisfactory, that is not on the unions. That is on the fact that we have timid, tepid, feckless management in the school leadership posts and in the superintendency who are failing at their first obligation, which is to identify ineffective educators and either see that they improve or that they are no longer in front of classrooms. When reformers then throw this all on the unions, I think, A, they're mistaken. B, I would love to see, I do think that unfortunately the AFT and NEA then wind up sharing some of the culpability, because I would like to see them calling out feckless school leaders and superintendents, and I don't think they do so. And I think that is because there is too often a convenient Horace's compromise among school boards, among superintendents, among principals, and among teachers, in which everybody agrees that nobody shall be called to account. And I think in that way, everybody winds up owning responsibility. But sure, so as we talk about teacher evaluation systems, there's really two ways to go about it. One is, to me, a robust, sensibly articulated system in which we are building a lot of room for managerial judgment, in which we are taking into account full evaluation, including how much they contribute to their teams on which they work, in which we are rigorously and systematically soliciting information on whether they're responding promptly and supportively to parental queries and parental needs. But unfortunately, I think policymakers are deeply concerned that they can't trust school or district leaders to make good or responsible judgments. And we've heard from the unions that they're concerned that school leaders are going to make politicized or capricious judgments. So what we've wound up with is, to my mind, a problematic compromise, which is relatively simplistic, one-size-fits-all state-level evaluation systems, which turn very heavily on simple value-added calculations. I don't think anybody thinks this is a particularly good or elegant solution. It just seems to me the one solution that where we default to, because because few people like the status quo, and nobody seems to be in a position where they're comfortable trusting the judgment of school leaders.
So, Randy, let me ask on specifics. So we have here in the District of Columbia the impact system. I think everybody would admit it's not perfect. We're still in early days. It needs to be tweaked. But it has led to hundreds of teachers losing their jobs. And there's a sense, I think, among the greater community that, okay, we finally have accountability in D.C. public schools. We have teachers who were failing kids for a long time, and something's happened to them. So what's wrong with that?
So frankly, as my understanding is that the last superintendent, or the second to last, the superintendent before Michelle Ray, Cliff Janey, actually fired more teachers than the impact system has done. And yet that factoid never gets out there. So, but let's take this back. First off, evaluation systems have been broken for a lot of the reasons that that Rick said before, which is it's really hard to actually fire people. And so what happens is people don't, and they blame something else. They'll blame tenure, they'll blame other things. It's hard. It's a hard thing to do. And
you mean it's hard in that people don't like to do it?
It's hard because people don't like to do it.
Okay.
People don't like to look somebody else in the eyes and say, you're fired.
Or you're doing a lousy job.
Or you're doing a lousy job.
Right.
And they'll, and there are some people who do like that, but most of us don't.
Right. Donald
I do.
Trump, yes.
Right. I do. And so.
Checker Finn rather enjoys it.
So, let's not go through the list of the people who do though. But actually, what the union did, what our union did, and you both know this, is that we actually spent some time in the last couple of years saying, okay, how do we do this right? And so we saw that you can't just take, we used to actually do what Rick suggested, finger point at administrators, say you're wrong, say you haven't done what you need to do. And actually we stopped that. And what we started doing instead was saying, let's figure out what is the right way to do this. And number one, we know that competence matters. Any school teacher you talk to will tell you that they want teachers teaching side by side with them who know their stuff and know how to engage kids and love kids. And so, you know, the first iteration that our union tried in terms of getting at this was through a peer review process. And some school districts did it and some school districts didn't. The second iteration in this generation that we've tried to do is that we said in January 2010, after a lot of work with our leaders and looking at evaluation systems, is that this drive-by evaluation of an administrator staying in your classroom for 20 minutes once a year, twice a year doesn't work. But also the test score evaluation doesn't work either. And particularly given that this generation of test scores don't actually align to what kids need to know and be able to do. Having said that, we need to have evaluations that both measure what teachers are doing in a classroom, how they engage, but also whether or not kids have learned. What am I teaching and whether or not kids have learned? And so we've actually tried to come up with a framework that does that, that includes, to some extent, you all know this because this is the only thing that got any attention, that includes student learning and test scores, but also includes practice. And there are about 100 districts, including, you know, Pittsburgh and Hillsborough and others, that are using this kind of evaluation system. It's very different than Impact in two respects. Number one, the system we're talking about is not simply about sorting, it is primarily about supporting teachers to grow their craft. And number two, it is something that was done with teachers, not to teachers.
So if you got your ideal system in place, Randi, in one of these cities, at the end of the day, it goes through, it doesn't just sort, it supports all of that, but still there's going to be some teachers that don't make the grade.
Absolutely right.
I mean, what would you guess? Is that 5% of the teachers, 10%?
Look, you know,
in a typical district?
And frankly, if I came up with a factor, if I said any percentage like that, the blogs all around town tomorrow is going to be, Weingarten says X percentage of teachers should be fired.
Right, so they're hoping
I
they'll
don't.
do it.
So,
Yes, so the answer is.
So look, what happens if you have a really good evaluation system that has credibility, and all of a sudden, 2 teachers are fired in a district, or 2,000 teachers are fired? The real issue becomes, is there credibility for that system? And frankly, that's what we need. And we're in a huge R&D process right now, and I think that the bottom falling out of the economy and of school, state, and local budgets is actually going to make this worse, not better. About a year or two ago, I was much more optimistic that we could do this because this is really time intensive. And any principal who doesn't say that is someone who's not telling the truth. It is, if you actually want to spend some time really doing good evaluations, a principal has to, or whoever the mentor is or whoever the evaluator is, you sit with the teacher. You say, okay, what are you trying to accomplish in this lesson? You watch the lesson. You sit with somebody after the lesson and say, did we accomplish that? You then talk about what else you need to do. You look at student data to say, did kids actually get what I was trying to teach? Was there that kind of engagement? Yep. So the real issue, the issue that's never on the table here, is that if we want to have really good evaluation systems like they do in Singapore, which is about continuous improvement, yes, it's about sorting people that ought not be in the profession, and that due process procedures have to be really quick. But if you really want to do this right, it takes a lot of time, and that kind of time costs money, and that is where we're going to find that investment to do that.
Make it quick.
Okay, 2 points. One, I think the issue here is like the one we raised before, that when it comes to the evaluation as a formative tool, absolutely, I think there's a hugely constructive role for dealing teachers in, and I think systems in which especially using today's relatively crude value-added metrics, incorporating that without building these systems so that they rest on that is smart and healthy. But I think just like we talked about before, there are also things that teachers are just going to resist. I think when we start talking about using those even thoughtfully constructed systems to terminate teachers, the nature of a union is it doesn't represent the good teachers. Its legal responsibility to represent all teachers who are members. And it is simply difficult to convince, I think, all teachers that to be enthusiastic about removing low performers. So I think there is going to be much more room for collaboration on the formative side of it than on the removal side.
But that's why we have embedded in the process we're doing. Look, I'm not saying that this is easy, but our union and our membership at our last national convention adopted this evaluation framework. And when we actually put all the pieces together, our executive council adopted this. I'm not saying it's easy, but we represent all teachers. We have to make sure that teachers are treated fairly, but I think it deserves teachers as well as communities in which they live and work when one says that the union's job is only to deal with the back end. The union's job is to help them get the tools and conditions that they need that they would not be able to get alone. A Bill Gates can represent himself quite effectively. Same with Eli Broad. But an individual teacher without that kind of collective work can't. I'm not saying, Rick, that you're wrong about this in terms of how hard it is, but I'm saying that there are unions all across this country, New Haven, Baltimore, ABC, Toledo, who have actually, New York City, who have actually confronted this and said, look, we have to be about fairness, but we have to be about quality.
And okay, no.
Let's get some questions. We're going to start with press. We have a couple of members of the press here. In honor of the First Amendment, we will give them priority at first. Are there any members of the press who would like to ask a question? Yes? No? Anybody? Okay, then we will open it up more broadly.
We've got a question from Twitter here. This is from Greg Mullenholz, who's twittering at Mullenholz II. And his question is for Randi. If unemployment is at 9% and 3 million jobs are open due to skills mismatch, doesn't that point to the need for college and career-ready standards?
Yes, it of course points to that, but frankly, I don't want to wait 12 years to try to figure that out. Let's figure out how, in a community right now, where there are jobs available, how we can reskill people to get to those jobs.
Okay, we have a question in the back. By the way, please tell us who you are, where you're from, and if you can keep your comment to 140 characters or less, like they do on Twitter, that would be excellent.
And Mike, let me just say for the record here that I am also for reskilling, and I am also for getting people matched into good jobs.
Ah, excellent. We have a long policy agenda now. Good.
Okay. That's a challenge to me, Mike, right? Linda McKay, International Learning Services. I want to direct a question to Randi. In working with teachers, one of the things I hear in the evaluations, they want evaluations beyond the test scores, and especially some of the things that you mentioned in creating a culture for learning, for students coming to school, for doing their work, for believing they can learn, and yet people call that the soft skills or you can't evaluate it. But teachers are saying that's a huge piece of success for them.
Right.
Does your evaluation that you've developed speak to that?
Yes.
And could you elaborate a tiny bit?
Look, the frameworks that we've spoken to are also about creating a culture and a climate for innovation and for opportunity to grow. And so there are things that need to happen, which is how do you actually have the tools and conditions so that, let's even talk about time. How is there the time to ensure that kids are actually engaged with one another in productive work, doing teamwork kind of work, things that are not tested on standardized tests, doing the kind of critical thinking and problem solving that is so necessary in this very fast-paced knowledge economy that we're in. And so it's part of the framework is the environment, is there opportunity to create that kind of environment? And the way in which we try to test this in plain English is through something we call 360-degree accountability, meaning it's not just accountability up to down, but it's accountability down to up. Do people have the tools and conditions that they need to have an environment for kids? The best way I can explain it, most people go to it as saying, are schools safe and orderly places? Are there the kind of wraparound services that kids may need? And I am really delighted that in the Columbus school, one of the schools you're doing, because one of our first issues were whether or not wraparound services were important. And I'm really delighted that one of the Fordham schools is now going to have those kind of wraparound services in Columbus. But dealing with the kind of ancillary needs that kids may have, or dealing with kind of how do you teach the soft skills, that's part of our evaluation system, but creating the opportunity. The last thing I'll say on this is people get this in business. I watched Rahm Emanuel at the last Clinton Global Initiative give a greeting, and the greeting was about Chicago and about his role being to create an environment that was conducive to grow business. A principal and a superintendent's role is also to help create an environment that is conducive to learning, and that's part of our evaluation system.
It's interesting you mentioned a superintendent's role. Stephen Brill thinks you should be superintendent of the New York Public Schools.
Yes, I've heard.
Ready to accept? Okay. I'm going to do a quick round that I call...
I have a great job that I love right now.
All right, good. It's going to be called the weakest link. Okay, I'm going to ask each of you what I think is the weakest parts of your argument. Okay, I'll start with you, Rick. All right, so you say we should trust principals. We need to give managers more discretion. Yet in most places they have full discretion today to terminate untenured teachers, and yet they almost never do. So isn't that a big problem with your whole theory about trusting frontline leaders and managers?
Yeah, huge. This is actually, and this is why we're winding up with these relatively crude, relatively simplistic, one-size-fits-all state systems, because school leaders and district leaders haven't earned anybody's confidence that they will actually go ahead and use the discretion that they're given. So reformers and policymakers, rather than default to these judgments, are saying, heck with it, we're going to write these relatively automatic triggers into state law, and teachers, whatever kind of the complicating factors in the site, are going to be evaluated and even removed based on relatively simple measures.
Okay. Randi, 4 words, last in, first out. Indefensible, right?
Seniority was a proxy for fairness. One of the things that evaluation systems will do will be to make last in, first out moot. The only regret I have with the way in which this debate has gone on in the last 6 months is it's obfuscated the whole impact of large amounts of layoffs on children. And what we're starting to see in school districts, first off, we saw a bunch of unions actually find ways to mitigate the layoffs and mitigate the cuts to student services, whether you're talking about Toledo or New York City or throughout.
Yeah.
But it mitigated, it obfuscated the fact that there are real impacts with this level and magnitude of layoff. In the absence of this level and magnitude of layoff, real evaluation systems about performance will mean that experience matters to some extent, but you're not going to have an impact of last in, first out.
All right. So once the evaluation systems are up and going, you would be willing to say goodbye to last in, first out.
What we're saying is that nobody's going to call that question anymore, because if you're really about evaluation.
Well, they call the question because there's still state laws that say you must use last in, first out.
But if there's confidence that so the question is this: if there are similarly situated people who have actually performed well, similarly situated who have performed well, in that situation, experience should matter. That's what I'm saying, is that if people really believed that teachers were all effective and there was an effective evaluation system, this issue would be moot. That's what I'm saying.
Gotcha. All right, let's do one more from the audience. Why don't we go over here? Yes. Say your name, who you are, ask your question, make it short. Yes.
Hi, my name is Lindsay Fine. I'm from the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. And I guess my question more generally, we've touched on this a little bit. What is then the federal role in a lot of these reforms that you're talking about? Be it teacher evaluations, be it LIFO, be it collective bargaining. What is the federal role here?
For me, I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity for the feds to do more harm than good. So when I hear people's, I think highly qualified teaching language has been a net negative. When I hear some of the advocacy groups starting to talk about highly effective teachers and highly effective school leaders, I start to get nervous feelings in the base of my spine. Look, I think the most useful place here is when the feds are incentivizing states to act, particularly Title II dollars, as we talk, say, about the No Child Left Behind reauthorization, that there are opportunities here to provide political cover to superintendents and to state leaders and to union leaders to do some of what Randy's talking about, to step forward past these kind of mechanistic systems that were designed when we had no way to identify a good teacher from a bad teacher, when we were pretty uncertain as to what effective school outcomes looked like, and when we could frankly get all of the talent we wanted because college-educated women were becoming teachers because nothing else was open to them, so we didn't have to worry much about competing for talent. Since the world has changed, I think states and districts need to re-engineer their systems, and I think, frankly, in terms of how to get there, Randy and I have some points of agreement, and where we'd like to get to, we have some points of agreement, and I'd like to see the federal government providing their opportunities for states and districts that came forward with the most ambitious, the boldest plans to focus on quality, to focus on smarter use of the talent they've got, to focus on removing ineffective educators. I'd like to see them in a position to compete for dollars to support plans that they're devising, rather than see them coming forward with plans which pledge that they are going to be able to fulfill conditions that the federal government is going to lay out in a particularly prescriptive fashion.
Randy, is this an area of agreement with Rick?
This is, look, I think Rick is, we may disagree with what those look like, but I think Rick is right about that. And I think that but there's one other role that the federal government has. And if you look at what Kennedy thought about, Johnson did in terms of ESEA, it is that ESEA was originally about kids who were being left behind and how do we create equity. And that is a really important role, because we have to, if we really actually believe in opportunity for all, we have to actually act like that. And so there's that role, and there's also the role of trying to create opportunity to create an evidence-based system of things that work. Because ultimately, if we have evidence of what works, then we can do the kind of sustaining and scaling up that is so important. I think one of the toughest things in education these days is that we never scale up that which works. We rarely sustain it, and we never scale it up. And we don't know how to balance between the local autonomy that's so essential in education, plus a need to ensure that all kids have a certain foundational base of knowledge so that they're prepared for what comes in front of them.
Okay, I'm going to give you each now 1 minute to identify some areas where you think there is some common ground. If we were going to have some agenda that say, okay, here's where we could march hand in hand, kumbaya, off into the sunset. Rick, you first.
All right, let me preface this. So let me save 30 seconds for that, 30 seconds for this. There's no reason we should be able to sing kumbaya. The founders believed in serious, vigorous debate and disagreement. James Madison, Federalist 10, was essentially a pay-in to the value of faction and how in a free country we check and balance each other, not just through institutions, but because good-hearted, reasonable people are going to disagree about important questions of our time. And I am sick to death of this notion that if you are doing something for the kids, that there is one right answer, that it's a multiple choice. Good, smart, reasonable people
should be engaged in these debates because we have honest disagreements about what's in the best interest of the kids and how to get there. And I think we should be able to disagree vigorously, but with respect for one another. A couple points of agreement, I think, that are pretty clear. Or at least one is I think people who are self-proclaimed reformers have a massively overestimated how technically skilled we are at this point in terms of using tests to measure teacher effectiveness and in trying to build complex systems of evaluation and pay that are laid more or less solely on top of grade 3 to 8 reading and math scores as currently measured. I think this is an error we made a century ago in the progressive era, and I think we have overshot the mark once again. Second, I think there are enormous opportunities to professionalize by taking seriously the need to identify weak performers, help them improve, to recognize people who are terrific, and to systematically move out people who stink at this work. And I think we can agree on that. Third, I think we agree that we can use talent much smarter and in much more creative ways at schools. And for me, I think this is very much about using technology to assist in this process. And I think Randi agrees with me more or less there. And fourth, I think what we need to do is take a large look at large existing commitments on pensions, on structures, on how we spend dollars. And I think the priorities we go in with and how we do that are going to differ. But I think Randi has frequently said over time that she is open to the need to rethink these industrial era arrangements.
So I think we may not agree on what the machinations of Rick's last point look like. But I think what you're seeing here is there has to be an openness to not the goal of helping all kids achieve not only to their God-given potential, but to create opportunity for them to face the life they're going to face in an economy that changes at breakneck speed, in a democracy that needs to be rekindled. That is our goal in public education. And we may have vigorous disagreements in terms of how to get there, but what you see here is an openness to explore different ideas. That is kind of the biggest, I think, agreement that we have. And there are certain agreements underneath that, which Rick, with the exception, again, of how you get there in terms of changing the industrial model to a craft model, I think Rick actually said those are some of the points of agreement. Using people differently, trying to focus on evaluations in a way that do actually promote continuous improvement, but also deal with issues of if people are not cutting it, they can't be in the profession. We want to deal with it fairly, but we have to deal with that. We may disagree with some of the other ways in which schools look and act, but we have to be open to new ideas and to doing things differently. Having said that, the one place of real disagreement is in Washington, D.C., we can debate the issues vigorously, and I totally and completely agree with Rick about the Madisonian democracy, and I really and focusing on how we ensure and enshrine our democracy and have those checks and balances are very important in a non-demagogic way. At the ground level, though, you have to find common ground, because at the end of the day, if you don't find common ground in terms of how you equip teachers with the tools and conditions to do their work, they're going to have to do this alone. And the one thing we've learned in terms of education is no one can do this alone. It does actually take a village to raise children, particularly in this complex world. And we actually, on the ground, have to find common ground, both in terms of, less as much in terms of policy, but in terms of implementation, to ensure that teachers, parents, and others have the tools that they need to help kids learn.
Okay, please join me in thanking our guests today. I think we've quoted many presidents. We've had FDR quotes, we've had Reagan quotes, Hillary Clinton quotes. Here's one more. Here's a Barack Obama quote.
She wasn't president.
Yes, she was not president. Thank you, First Lady. Thank you for disagreeing without being disagreeable. And this is a real model, again, of how we can have some of these debates and fight things out without going to personal attacks. Thanks for joining us. We will be sending you information about future events at Fordham. This event will be broadcast online shortly at www.edexcellence.net, where you can find also our wonderful flypaper blog, the Education Gadfly Show, all of the other materials. Until next time, thank you from the Thomas B. Fordham Institute.